I'm going to tell you a story, and it's the story of my life. Last year I turned 50, so it's a contracted 25-minute version, so that's about 2 years per minute. So this is the short version that I gave at the TEDx Berkeley talk, and I call it The Duty to Act because it reflects my experience and I think our need as academics to go beyond the ivory tower as privileged individuals. It reflects, I think, a need for social responsibility that we don't often see in academia. Before I tell that story, I'm going to start with this phrase. It's a phrase that I learned while working in Southern Africa. A phrase that was so dear to me. I actually had it tattooed on my body. I never thought I'd get it tattooed. But loosely translated, it means people are people through other people. So I never tell my story without thanking the people who made me who I am. And first and foremost, my family. This is an old photograph. They don't like for me to be in them anymore. But first and foremost, my mother and my father who have supported me over these 50 years. But also, as a biologist, I know that I wouldn't be here without them. So their love and support. And also this woman, Catherine Kim, for her love and support, my wife. And these two, my son and my daughter, wouldn't be here without her as well. I also want to thank my funding sources, and also I want to disclose that I have been funded by the chemical manufacturer that I'll sort of talk about in a not so nice way, but that's because they did not so nice things. And then I want to thank all of the students that have been involved. I've been here now for 30 years, and a number of students, and especially undergraduates, have been involved. Everybody in blue, here's an undergraduate. This is a more recent list of my students, and this is my current laboratory. I've had the opportunity to work with a wonderful group of very diverse individuals, including many students who grew up with families that worked in the agricultural industry, so they have been directly exposed to and experienced many of the chemicals that I've studied in my laboratory. I learned something very important from my grandmother who passed away a few years back. And she and my father both were great storytellers, and what they taught is that if you want to get a point across, don't preach, don't teach, don't lecture, don't give talks, just tell a good story. And so whenever I present my data, my science, or anything, I try to just tell you a good story. And I'm going to start my story today. We don't have time to go all the way back to when I was a little kid, but I'm going to start my story. And about 3 weeks back, I was in Minneapolis to give a talk at a small school, McAllister College. And I was in a restaurant in the airport, and a woman came up and she took my order and she brought my food and she brought me a bill. She said, "Well, what are you doing here in Minneapolis?" And I said, "Well, I'm here to give a lecture at McAllister College." And she said, "Give a lecture?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm a scientist, I'm a professor." And she said, "Wow." I was dressed like this. This is my typical professional attire. And she said, "Wow, you don't look like a professor." And I looked back at her and I said, "That's funny, because you really look like a waitress." I don't normally judge people by their appearance, but she had the apron and the pad and the name tag, so And in fact, I didn't say that. That's what I wish I had said. What I said was, "Thank you for the compliment," but I knew it wasn't really a compliment. But the other thing that I really thought about was, not only do I not look like a professor, most of the time, I don't feel like a professor. Most of the time, I feel like just a little boy who likes frogs. And I always show this book when I give my talks. My mom sent this book to me when my son was born 25 years ago. And she wrote a note in it that said, "This was your dad's favorite book." And I don't remember the book, but I remember that I had been interested in amphibians, interested in frogs, interested in biology and science for as long as I can live, as long as I can remember. And in many ways, I feel like just a little boy who likes frogs trying to answer questions. That all changed for me a few years back, that perspective. I filed a patent on using frogs to try to understand how chemicals affect their hormones and their reproduction and development. And I got hired then by contract while I was at Berkeley to use my frogs to study this chemical called atrazine. Atrazine is an herbicide or weed killer that's primarily used on corn, is what it looks like for the chemists in the audience. It's the so-called S-chlorotriazine. And at the time, it was the #1 selling agrochemical in the world. 80 million pounds a year still used in the United States. And we started studying this chemical on the development of the African clawed frog, the most commonly used frog in biology. In fact, it's so commonly used that people in the US, it used to be used for pregnancy tests and other developmental studies, and it's so common that people release them into the environment here in the US. So you can actually get them in San Francisco and San Diego, these African clawed frogs, or as I often tell people, mine are technically African American clawed frogs, because I collect them from here. So we showed that if we expose these animals to atrazine throughout development, their testes look like this. And probably most of you aren't used to looking at frog gonads. In fact, this is probably the most frog gonads you'll see in all of your life. So one thing I can promise you from this story. But these are slices under the microscope of control and atrazine exposed testes. And their testes are very much like human testicles in the sense that they have testicular tubules. So here's a control, here's a testicular tubule that are filled with mature sperm. But when you're exposed to atrazine, the testicular tubules are essentially devoid of sperm. They're cellular debris. We discovered that they don't have enough testosterone to maintain sperm production. We discovered also that when they're exposed throughout development, many of the animals turn out like this. So these are the kidneys. Again, you're probably not used to looking at frog gonads, but here's testes, and here's ovaries, and here's more testes, and here's ovaries. And that's not how frogs normally develop. There are fish that are naturally hermaphroditic, but not frogs. It turns out that some of these animals, even though they're genetically male, so they should have testes, grow up to completely become female. So these are two copulating frogs. The one on the bottom, who's laying the eggs, is genetically male, even though it has ovaries and lays eggs. So this was kind of a big deal for the company. We published 2 papers on this issue in Proceedings in the National Academy of Sciences. You might guess the company wasn't that excited about the attention that our work got. And they stopped funding me, by the way. And then we later showed that in North American frogs, so here testes, they don't become hermaphrodites, but that atrazine induces ovaries and eggs to develop in the testes. So this is actually a testis that had eggs bursting through the surface of the male's testes because they don't have oviducts. They don't have a way to lay the eggs. They just grow and yolk up inside the animal's testes. So we proposed a mechanism that sort of led me down the road. Remember, I'm just a little boy who likes frogs. That sort of led me down the road I didn't expect. So here, imagine that this is a testis. If you have a testis, you should make testosterone. In fact, the word testosterone you guys know the word portmanteau? It's a portmanteau. I didn't learn that word until I was 49 years old. It's like when you stick 2 words together. Like smoke and fog, you get smog. Twist and jerk, you get twerk. Testosterone is a portmanteau that literally means testicular hormone. So it's technically the male hormone. So we proposed that what atrazine was doing was turning on an enzyme, the machinery, if you will, aromatase, that converts testosterone into estrogen, the female hormone. The word literally means generator of estrus, another portmanteau. And the consequences are your testosterone goes away, so you don't show male typical behavior, you don't maintain sperm in your testes, and you're also making estrogen inappropriately, which will do things, if you're a frog, like induce eggs or induce ovary development, even though you might be genetically male. So at this point, I'm a little boy who likes frogs, of course, but I start to think about if the atrazine in the water is affecting the frogs, what about the fish? Or what about the other animals that come to drink from that same water supply? Because see, all animals, doesn't matter if you're a fish, a dog, a frog, a cat, a hog, or a human, all animals, if you're a reproductively active individual, make and use testosterone and estrogen in the same way. Not only did I become concerned about the aquatic animals and the animals that are drinking from the water, but what about the humans? This is Lake Nabugabo in Uganda, who are using the water here, which is agricultural runoff, as their sole source of drinking and cooking and bathing water. When we make testosterone and estrogen the same way as our frogs, what about here? So I live here, this is my village, Oakland, and my house is somewhere here, but my water just comes from there, from this reservoir. And as I'll tell you, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, doesn't regulate atrazine in a way that it would be below levels in our drinking water that we know to be biologically effective in animals. To give you an idea of how it might impact humans, because we can't do experiments on humans, this is work from a colleague of mine, Shauna Swan, and what she showed was If you look at what she called controlled men, these are men in Columbia, Missouri, these are their atrazine levels in their urine, compared to men who have a low sperm count and can't get their wife pregnant in Columbia, Missouri, they have significantly more atrazine in their urine. In fact, men who have low sperm count and can't get their wives pregnant have enough atrazine in their urine to chemically castrate a frog or a fish. 0.1 parts per billion. So they're urinating out the same amount of atrazine that we use in our experiments in the laboratory. Now I've left the axis up there because now I've squashed down the data. Because here now are the levels of atrazine in field workers in California. And I'll squash that down again, because here now are the levels of atrazine in men who apply atrazine in California. 2,400 parts per billion. So men who apply atrazine in California have atrazine levels in their urine that are 24,000 times higher than we know to be associated with adverse effects on fertility in men in Columbia, Missouri. Men who apply atrazine in California have levels of atrazine in their urine that are 24,000 times higher than we use in our experiments here in the Berkeley campus. In other words, one of these guys could pee in a bucket. I can dilute the atrazine in their urine 24,000 times and use the atrazine in their urine to chemically castrate 24,000 tanks of 30 tadpoles each. Now I'm just a little boy who likes frogs, but now I get introduced to terms like environmental justice and environmental racism, because 90% of those men are Latina, primarily Mexican American immigrants. In many cases with life expectancies of 40. And in addition to atrazine, to grow our food, they're exposed to chemicals like chlorpicrin, originally developed as a nerve gas in World War II. They're exposed to chemicals like 2,4-D, a component of Agent Orange that was used to destroy food in Southeast Asia during the time of the Vietnam War. What's more is, there's concern, if you're a human, not just about the loss of sperm due to the loss of testosterone, if you're exposed to atrazine, but aromatase and estrogen are intricately involved in the top 2 cancers in humans. Prostate cancer in men, and mammary cancer, breast cancer, in women. In humans, so now we're no longer talking about frogs, we've shown this and somebody else has. If you take human cell lines that don't normally express aromatase or make estrogen, and you give them atrazine, they express aromatase, and they start making estrogen. Just like we've shown in fish, just like we've shown in amphibians, just like it's been shown in reptiles and birds and rats, human cell lines respond to atrazine in the same way. With regards to prostate cancer, and these are slices of a prostate, the company showed in their own factory in San Gabriel, Louisiana, that men who work in their factory bagging atrazine have an 8.4-fold higher incidence of prostate cancer compared to men who work in the same factory and live in the same area but don't work in the room where all the atrazine dust is. And this was shown in their own factory, which is located in a community that's 80% black, 80% African American. I'll tell you why that's important later. With regards to breast cancer, another study, again, it's not my work, shows that with a p-value less than 0.0001, women whose well water is contaminated with atrazine in Kentucky are more likely to develop breast cancer compared to women who live in the same community but don't use their well water for drinking. That's just a correlation, but if you look at rodents, the company's shown in their own published studies that if you give rats atrazine at the level shown here, there's an increased incidence of breast cancer. So there's a correlation in humans with breast cancer. You can induce breast cancer with atrazine in rats, and the mechanism by which atrazine increases aromatase and estrogen has been demonstrated not just in frogs, but also in human cell lines. This is significant because of the following. The #1 cancer in women is breast cancer. It's estrogen dependent. You are more likely to get, most women get breast cancer after menopause. So why are you getting an estrogen dependent cancer when your estrogen levels at a time in your life are lower than they've ever been? It's because your likelihood of getting breast cancer depends on your lifetime exposure to estrogen. And it's also because even though your blood levels of estrogen might be low during menopause, the cells around the breast cancer make their own estrogen. So for example, and ER stands for the estrogen receptor, the cells locally make estrogen that binds to that receptor to sort of crank the car up and stimulate those damaged cells to grow and to divide and to become tumors and to spread. In fact, the importance of aromatase is so important in breast cancer that the #1 treatment right now for breast cancer is a chemical called letrozole that decreases aromatase, that decreases estrogen, so that even if you have these damaged cells, they don't grow and spread. How much sense does that make when the #1 contaminant of drinking water is a chemical called atrazine, which increases aromatase, increases estrogen, promotes breast cancer in rats, and is associated with breast cancer in humans? Well, you can imagine the trouble I got in when I pointed out the following. Novartis Oncology offers treatments for cancers that range from breast cancer. Yeah, the same company that was selling 80 million pounds of atrazine per year in the year 2000, the exact same company was selling letrozole to treat breast cancer. So if you were living in the Midwest taking letrozole to decrease your aromatase and treat your breast cancer, it was fighting it out with another chemical, the most common contaminant of drinking water, made by the same company at the same time. I point out that their company is based in the production facility is based in San Gabriel, Louisiana. That's 80% African American, 80% black. I point that out for the following reason. These are the top 13 cancers you're going to get living in the US. In red now, 11 of the 13 are the cancers that you're more likely to get if you're black, if you're African American. It's a risk factor. What's more is if you look at mortality relative to Caucasian or white Americans, you're more likely to die from 13 out of 13 cancers if you're black, if you're African American, and this is corrected for socioeconomic status and access to health care. Does that mean there's a biological difference? Maybe. But my colleagues, who are much better experts at cancer than I am, say that less than 30% of cancer can be explained by genetics. It's an environmental disease. So in other words, when your doctor tells you you're more likely to get cancer if your brother, your aunt, your sister, or somebody in your family has cancer, they're not telling you that you have bad genes. They're telling you you've been exposed to the same crap as the rest of your family. So I think what's happened is my interest in this aquatic organism has taught me a lot about this aquatic organism. Because we all develop and start out in water, just like my tadpoles do. And we now know that as humans, you will be exposed, your children will be exposed to over 300 synthetic chemicals before they leave the womb. One of the studies that has moved me the most to thinking about how I have to be more than just a little boy who likes frogs is that the EPA showed that rats that are fed atrazine are more likely to have abortions because of the hormone imbalance it creates. Of those rats that don't abort, the sons are more likely to be born with prostate disease. They're born with the prostate of an old man. Of those rats that don't abort, the daughters are born with impaired memory development, such that their daughters and sons have retarded growth and development because they can't feed them properly. This moved me because that rat on the bottom never saw atrazine. The rat on the bottom was affected by atrazine that its grandmother was exposed to. That means that my grandchildren, your grandchildren, could be affected by chemicals that we're using today. That moved me and made me realize that I have to be more than just a little boy who likes frogs. The idea that my daughter, my son, that my grandchildren could be affected by chemicals that I'm studying that I have knowledge about. Right now there's a number of studies showing that atrazine is associated with birth defects if you're exposed during pregnancy as humans. Not my work, it's other people's work. And the EPA has acknowledged this, but they've said in a public statement that a monetary value is assigned to disease, impairments, and shortened lives and weighed against the benefits of keeping a chemical in use. That moves me in a very different way than just a little boy who likes frogs, because California is the 5th largest economy in the world because of agriculture. In fact, we produce 50% of the US's food. The cost is that we use more pesticides than any other state, and 90% of the workers are Latinx. So if you look at the counties that produce 50% of the US's food, that make us the 5th largest economy in the world, and if you plot onto that the 30 poorest towns in California, there's a disconnect between who pays that cost, the health impairment, and who gets those benefits. I crossed the line, so to speak, and as you can imagine, in crossing that line, I was criticized by the industry. They published statements saying, hey, biologists turned activists. I've turned, you can't be a scientist and an activist. They said things in the New Yorker magazine because I accused them of, or I pointed out that they had tried to discredit me. They said, I'm troubled by a suggestion that we have ever tried to discredit anyone, they said to the New Yorker magazine. Our focus has always been on communicating the science and setting the record straight. But when they lost a big court case around atrazine, and all of their secret private documents became public, look what the #1 goal of their science strategy was. I wonder where anybody got that idea. So I've switched now from what I was taught by my advisor, don't be an advocate, let the science speak for itself. I switched from that philosophy because Syngenta has published on their website, the company that makes this stuff now, that they assume no obligation to update forward-looking statements to reflect actual results. First off, who said shit like that? But two, more importantly, the EPA said that the ultimate decision is much bigger than science. They said this about my work on atrazine. It weighs in public opinion. If we spend all of our time publishing in Nature and PNAS and places that the public doesn't have access to, how can the public tell the EPA or help the EPA do its job? So now I follow a different philosophy, one that says those who have the privilege to know have the duty to act. It comes from a pretty good source, this quote. So, thank you. Sorry for the trouble revving up, and thank you again for your invitation and for your time.